if you have enough points, you can just draw lines that align with anything.
Which is something I have argued. So I was like, Ray, I feel you, dude.
He's not necessarily wrong. Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Harrenstein. With me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today, we are very excited to get to start with a brand new book titled Where the Moon Stands Still, Revealing the Cosmic Genius of Ohio's Indigenous Earthworks by James W. Graham. We mentioned last time at the end of the last episode that this is a little special for us because this book was sent to us as an advanced reader's copy.
I know, at first time.
Yeah, so it's a new book, and the author contacted us and we thought, let's give it a shot, and so we're going to jump into that. So Barbara, what is the book about?
So the book is about, I guess, two men. The author knows that it takes place in Ohio, and it's kind of the story of how they met and them studying a particular site in Ohio and looking at how it essentially aligns to the cosmos, I guess.
In what ways we're not exactly sure yet.
This book is interesting, though, because it's about the pull. I mean, it's about the site, too.
Anyway.
And you learn about, we've learned a little bit about the site, but so far it's really about the kind of journey of these two individuals, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, so nobody in this book so far, the author or the two people he's talking about, are archaeologists.
Yeah.
The author, I'm unclear on his background. I think his applies.
Yeah.
But I think he's in literature. And then one of the guys is a philosopher and the other guy is an astronomer.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things I was a little concerned about, but it looks like it's panning out pretty well so far. So kind of talking about it already. So let's just get started.
Sounds good.
Chapter 1 starts with, I'd say, just kind of some background, some scene setting.
Yeah. And I guess now because I was a little bit confused at first because I was like, golf course? Why are we on a golf course?
Yeah.
But I guess there was a golf course that was obviously in recent times built next to and on the site and on the ruins and stuff. So, I mean, that kind of stuff happens. There's a history of mounds and stuff being used for fill dirt. There's one I saw in Georgia somewhere where it had a house on it. There's a shell mound down in Jupiter, Florida that has a lighthouse keeper's house on it. So that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah. And really, though it's not ideal, country club golf course is probably one of the better uses for these things if you're going to misuse them.
Yeah. At least it's green spaced rather than developed.
Right.
Really.
Or being used for fill dirt or whatever. Yeah. So this is mostly just kind of setting the scene about what these things are, how they're all over the place, what kind of scale we're talking about. So the focus for this one, although we will talk about plenty of mound complexes, focus is mostly on the Newark Earthworks near Newark, Ohio. Go figure. And these suckers they're big. It's an octagon shape and a circle shape.
Which the octagon shape, that's pretty unique. I can't think of another mound I've learned about that had that shape to it. I've seen, square, rectangle, and then obviously there's the ones that are shaped like different animals and things. But this is pretty interesting. Yeah, it's huge. It's a pretty big. I like that the author includes photos.
Yes, that's been very helpful. But he says if you draw a line through the octagon, through the circle, you get a half a mile distance.
Yeah.
Give you the sense of the scale. 7 million cubic feet in constructing these. And remember, these were built with no wheelbarrows, metal tools, or beasts of burden.
Yeah.
So every single bit of soil was carried in baskets on backs, essentially. And it wasn't just the nearest soil you could grab either. They're grabbing, maybe even shipping in soil from other places for the right purposes.
Yeah, and I think it's in this chapter where the author kind of talks a little bit about that. These were engineered.
Yes.
It wasn't just when we go to the beach and we start throwing sand to make a mound. These were engineered by these folks. They understood the geology, the geography, the different types of soils, the hydrology.
Is why so many of them have lasted so well, too.
Yeah.
He does talk about how early Europeans kind of abused these places. We get into this a bit more, but essentially a lot of them are gone now because, like Barbara said, they've been used for backfill and things and have been destroyed either casually or actively, I'd say.
Yeah. And I know in other episodes, we've also talked about antiquarian. And there's a little bit of that mixed in here too, where people were curious. Some of them, it was just curiosity. Others, as he talked about a little bit, I think in the next chapter, was thought, these Native Americans, there's no way they could have built these. And so they were excavating them and studying them to kind of almost disprove that they were built by the Native Americans. There's no way these people could have built this.
Mm-hmm. And so then moving on to chapter 2, we basically just start with the story of the two guys. We kind of get their life stories. We've complained about a particular author doing this before, The Lost City of the Monkey God.
Yeah.
But this is entirely different because it became immediately clear that this isn't just meant to tell us about the mounds. This is kind of about their journey getting involved and interested in investigating these mounds.
Yeah. So it's a story about Bob and Ray, but also about the mounds.
Yeah. And there are plenty of cases I've noticed a trend in this book where like it'll go off on what feels like a tangent in the moment, but then it always comes back around and it becomes clear why we were talking about that, which is a complaint we've had about certain other books, especially our previous one.
Yeah, no, I like, even though it does seem sometimes like there's a weird flow, like
there's a reason.
You're not quite sure where he's going with it all the time. There's always a reason. And I kind of enjoy the flow of this book thus far.
I do too. It's very nice and pleasant to read. The approach of going through these guys and using their story does a good job of also kind of humanizing the scenario.
Yeah.
Rather than just throwing information at you. Now we have someone to relate to, at least on some level.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of their backstory we have to get into. I think it's important to note that Bob Horn grew up in the area and was always fascinated by what they called Indian mounds. And that's one thing the author does a very good job of talking about is the language used.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
I did too. Again, he says certain terms are not in use anymore, but depending on the context, he will still use them to talk about them. So when he's like referencing the perspective of the time and uses Indian mounds, there's a reason for that. He's not just saying this is a problem, but I'm going to ignore it.
And I like that this chapter starts off with like the childlike fascination about these things, or like the childlike wonder, because I feel like that's what gets a lot of people interested in archaeology. You see these great, amazing sites and you're like, wow. And you start asking questions, and it's
even as adults.
Yeah. And it's just a very relatable way to open up this chapter.
Yeah. Anyway, Bob was born in 1930, and through schooling and such, he ended up in philosophy. And then I think the best way of summing that up is he ended up back in his home area teaching at Earlham College. And at that point, we jump to the other person, who is Ray Hively, unsure of the...
Yeah, I'm not sure.
He was born in the 1950s, so a little while later, and he was always into the sky and ended up going into astronomy, did some internships with NASA and things.
Just pretty cool. When I was reading that, I was like, oh, wow, like that's impressive.
He was interning like when moon missions were going on, and then moon missions ended right when he was needing a job, and he kind of was left hung out to dry, essentially.
Yeah.
But he taught in a couple places for a while, and then ultimately ended up at the same college.
Yeah, that's where the two met.
That's where they met, and they met in kind of a funny way that I appreciated, because they had a dean who was like, hey, you guys need to teach a class together.
And they were like,
Yeah, I was like, I don't want to deal with this science guy. I don't want to deal with this arts guy, or whatever.
Yeah.
But then they found out they enjoyed arguing with each other.
Yeah, which is very, like when I was reading this, I was like, this is very like how academic stuff works, is you just are like, yeah, I like debating with this person. We're going to be friends.
And so the class they taught was the cosmology of Stonehenge. And they picked it because at the time it had just been discovered, announced, whatever it is, that Stonehenge had astronomical alignments.
Yeah, it was like all the rage of the time, it sounds like.
Really, it was very popular. A lot of the academics were very skeptical of the findings, though.
Yeah.
And so these guys also were both very skeptical, but they wanted to investigate it and understand it better.
Yeah, and I like the way this author explains and kind of discusses how skepticism is good in science. Mm-hmm. He does a really good job of, because I feel like, and I know I've harped on this before, but I harp on it because I think it's important. People read something and then it's proven untrue and they're like, oh, scientists know nothing. And, so I think it's important for people to keep in mind that a healthy dose of skepticism is kind of necessary in science.
Well, it's a process.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to unpack there. Like, what's your source? If you're reading from a news article, then be very skeptical of what the news article is telling you.
But even like if you are a scientist and somebody comes at you with like a great claim, skepticism is how you prove or disprove something or move to another theory and find things out.
Right. Or if you read an amazing claim, look into it a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do want to note too, this is a thing we've talked about in the past, that they aren't specifically saying that Stonehenge was a calendar, at least so far in this book. But I want people to know that as of what we know right now, Stonehenge itself was not a calendar. calendar. It doesn't mean it didn't have astronomical alignments, but it's not a calendar per se. Now, there is a series of post holes in the Stonehenge complex that is a calendar, but it's not part of the major stone complex that we see now.
Yeah, I was, as you were talking about that, I was reading because our Chariots of the Sun God makes an appearance, which I think we've talked about that in previous episodes, where I've never read it. I've heard it's horrible. The reviews are horrible, but it was written in the 1960s. But this is also kind of when we have aliens enter the conversation. I mean, obviously that has happened before, but when Stonehenge was all the rage, a lot of people, again, were skeptical about how could people from, early history create these great monuments and thus aliens, because for some reason that's where our brains go.
There is a conversation here about the terms prehistoric and mounds being out of favor. Mound is kind of reductive, I guess, to a lot of these places. That makes sense. Like we said, they're constructed.
Yeah.
And prehistoric is something that is becoming more and more out of favor. You may have heard us use it in the past, but we are transitioning our vocabulary to post-contact, usually is what we use now. In archaeology, we have been trained to use that simply to mean times where there are no written records.
Yeah.
And that's not always a clear-cut time either, but it has been sometimes weaponized against people, and so therefore it is not a term to be used anymore. So we are moving away from doing that. If you hear us slip up, let us know.
Yeah, we're transitioning.
We're working on it.
We're working on it.
We still have the habits.
We went to school when we were in school. It was prehistoric, and now it's pre-contact. So, we're working on the changing.
Yep.
And mounds, now we usually say earthworks.
Yes, but you have certainly heard us use mounds in the past too.
Yeah.
And I do note that the author still uses mounds sometimes, but it's usually directly referencing a mound-shaped earthwork rather than all the earthworks are mounds. Part of their class was to go out to some of the local earthworks and to do some mapping with the students. And they used a thing called a plane table for mapping these earthworks. Have you ever seen or used one of these before, Barbara?
I have seen them. I have not used them.
I had never even heard of them before. I had done a little compass mapping early in my career, but even then GPS was so common you didn't hardly need it. And so this is a cool little setup essentially to map areas and to get elevation and everything all at once. Now we often use total stations too.
Yeah.
So this is a cool little thing. Looks like a kind of thing you could set up at home even.
Yeah.
You need some things like a plumb bob and stuff, but you could set this up at home and do some of your own. It'd be kind of fun to try it out.
And this site, to be clear, had been surveyed prior, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And so it needed, like everything, as our technology improves, so does our mapping, and things need to be remapped occasionally.
Yeah. So there are corners to a square in this particular shape. And one of the things they found was how startlingly near perfect the 90-degree angles in the square were.
Yeah.
Especially for the size. We're talking about you can't really see the other end.
Yeah. And they kind of talk about that when they were talking about how surveying. And of course, there's the clubhouse for the golf course and stuff is kind of in the way. But even so, they were still able to figure out that this is really accurate.
Yeah.
And I feel, I don't know. I've never constructed an earthworks of any nature at all, unless a sandcastle counts. But just creating a circular mound, I feel would be very difficult. I don't know. The fact that these were so accurate is pretty amazing to me.
Yeah. And then we get a little more about their skepticism. Essentially, Ray, the astronomer, doesn't believe it because, if you have enough points, you can just draw lines that align with anything.
Which is something I have argued. So I was like, Ray, I feel you, dude.
He's not necessarily wrong. I think that's why a lot of people kind of get down these rabbit holes of everything aligning to something, and
yeah, you can make lines point wherever you want if you have enough points on the landscape.
So they decided to test on the Newark Earthworks, and the assumption will be they'll map it in really, really accurately, and Ray will be able to make it align with some things astronomically. I thought it was a little funny. They didn't seem to consider the possibility that it might actually be aligned to something.
See, I got the feeling that Ray was a little bit more skeptical than Bob.
I think Bob was skeptical, but maybe he had more understanding of the engineering involved in this.
Maybe, because I feel like Ray is the true skeptic in this duo.
But also the understanding of ancient peoples in this time. That's what people thought ancient peoples were and what they were capable of.
Yeah.
So they're working with their understanding understanding of the time. And I think they both thought this was impossible. And then in chapter 3, we kind of get the post-contact history of the mounds, essentially, I think is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
We get talk about a number of people who've mapped them, and thank goodness they did, because some of them are gone now.
Yeah, I mean, as inaccurate as some of these older maps are, and he talks a little bit about this, oftentimes they're the only evidence we have of them ever existing at all.
And a lot of them are pretty accurate still, too. Like we've seen old maps of Florida, for example, right? How wildly inaccurate they are. These, I believe, these are actual surveyors. They are doing actual surveying. While they may not be to our standards now or perfect, they are definitely not as far off as you might think. And then they are also sometimes the best we have. Yeah. And so this was very interesting because we covered a bunch of this in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries.
Yep.
But from different angles. And so this is giving us some more detail in some things and less detail in others. It actually complements it very nicely, I'd say. We do talk about David Wyrick, which is one of the hoaxes we actually talked about in that book. And essentially what happened here was he was failing in health and he went out to dig on a site and he found something that is marked that had Hebrew writing on it. And that's more or less where Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries ends. It does mention he found another one too easily, too quickly.
Yeah.
But this one delved a lot more into that whole situation. And it was very interesting about who was involved.
Right. Was he the hoaxed or the hoaxer?
Yeah. And the immediate skeptics too. Like there were people immediately skeptical of this thing.
Yeah.
Which is not something I necessarily picked up from Frauds.
And I also he was addicted to laudanum. So I feel like he was pretty ill.
He was pretty ill.
Yeah. I don't know how that plays into it, but I was like, oh, that's another aspect of the story that I think should be considered. It's this guy was heavily medicated.
But then later on, he finds another one. This essentially addresses all the criticisms of the first one very neatly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it seems to be thought that he was the victim of the hoax.
Right.
He was not necessarily the person doing the hoax himself. Now, interestingly, this book, I don't think Frauds went into this, talks about why, the motivation behind this.
Yeah, which is pretty fascinating. Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily for evil purposes. Basically, what was going on at the time was Abraham Lincoln was running for president. This is the time period we're talking about. And there's lots of talk about slavery. And the abolitionists are looking to establish... This is interesting, too, because I always understood the whole Lost Tribe of Israel thing as a fundamentally racist thing, harmfully racist thing, and it is. But at the time, some people were trying to use it as a reason to argue that slavery was abhorrent. Because basically, we are all related, and therefore, no one is lesser there, and slavery is evil.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, I was like, wow, this is kind of blowing my mind, because it's so, again, people are complicated, right? And you have to take things within the context of the time.
Yeah, and it's still racist and it's still harmful, but what a different motivation behind it.
Right, yeah. Yeah. So that kind of served as the motivation for at least this hoax, potentially. Yeah, this was a cool chapter. And because I felt like he was the hoaxer up until reading this, but then I was like, okay, wait, he might, I don't know. I obviously not taken laudanum, but the mental capacity he may have had at the time, I don't know that he would have the ability to really come up with this hoax by himself. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at the broader historical context, it's like, oh, okay. This very complex situation that I feel like maybe gets too simplified.
I think Frauds may have took it down the line that he was probably the victim as well, but it didn't go in near as much detail as this one does. And it didn't really establish it as much.
No, not at all.
Which wasn't the point of what he was trying to tell us.
That's
in that book, it was fine.
Yeah.
A couple other things that stood out in this one, he was talking about the Lost Tribe of Israel thing and how it's essentially been, people have tried to apply it to essentially every group of people in the world.
Yeah. I feel like oftentimes it's funny because we as humans either super simplify something or we make it overly complicated, and it's never what it's supposed to be. It's never right.
There was an interesting point in this chapter too where he cites author Isabel Wilkerson from her book Cast: The Origins of Our Discontents. And I haven't read this book.
Yeah.
But the quote kind of got my hackles up because essentially, and I looked into this some more, and it is interesting. It sounds like in the quote she is saying racism didn't exist until slavery.
Yeah.
There's lots of arguments here. So basically she's saying that the concept of race was formed and then racism followed. Whereas a lot of people will argue that the racism came first and race was created to justify racism.
Yeah.
But also what gets me too here is they're talking about racism and they mean only slavery and genocide.
Yeah.
And there's so many other ways of some more subtle ways of expressing racism. Even if you don't have the concept of race, the same behaviors are still there. And so at some point it almost becomes a moot argument to have. Bit of a rabbit hole we both went down on this one.
Yeah,
you can tell it got our hackles a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, also important to mention here, there is no biological base for racism. It is a purely cultural construct. That doesn't mean that it's not real, that people's experiences around race aren't real, but it is not based off of biology.
And I think we've talked about in previous episodes where people tried to look at biological differences of the races and how that was super problematic. Anthropology and archaeology was kind of utilized in that fashion historically as well. Very problematic. Archaeology has such a problematic history.
Yep. And so this kind of conversation around race, around the mounds, around the lost tribes of Israel, the whole IREC hoax is also, like we said, that is covered in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. And if this chapter interested you, if you liked hearing us kind of get worked up about these things, that series is a good next stop. Find a link in the show notes. And while you're there, we publish a new episode every 1st and 15th. So hit follow, and part 2 to Where the Moon Stands Still will be waiting for you. All right, moving on to chapter 4. I think this one is probably a pretty short one. There's not a ton I need to talk about. Basically, Bob and Ray start working on mapping the sites and researching, learning about the sites, looking at previous people who've mapped the sites. And only thing that really stood out to me here was they did find a really, really old aerial photography of the Newark Earthworks, which really kind of clarified what they look like. And this stood out to me because apparently an aerial photographer served in World War I, and he was in one of those spotter balloons.
Yeah, which we talked about earlier.
That the biplanes would always shoot down.
Yeah.
And so I've never heard an account from one of the people that was in the balloons and basically had to jump out multiple times.
I know,
They kind of got shot down a lot, I think.
Yes. But yeah, that was one of those tangents where I was like, where is this going? And then I was like, okay, actually, this is very cool.
And it did connect in pretty well because it was kind of talking about his story, how he ended up kind of where he was, where he took photos of the earthworks. So that worked out pretty well.
Apparently getting shot out of the sky multiple times from a balloon makes you really good at aerial photography.
Well, he was one of the pioneers of it. He invented this stuff. It was
he was
very
like,
neat.
You know what? I got shot out of the sky multiple times, but I just cannot get enough. So we're going to go up there and take some photos now that the war's over.
And this does talk a bit more about how the octagon in particular is a mystery on how that was constructed, because a circle, you could put a stake in the ground and a rope and then do a circle. But an octagon is a lot more complicated. That you can make that from 2 sets of squares.
Yeah.
But it's still a lot more complicated to build that. So fascinating.
Yeah. And I tried to draw an octagon because he's like, have you ever tried to draw one? I was like, I don't know that I've really, maybe as a kid or something. So I tried it and I was like, okay, this is horrible. Mm-hmm. And then even when I did like the 2 squares and connected the points, it was still not my best work. Right. But I do like the fact that in this chapter, there's like a really neat map that kind of, it's a 1847 map of the site. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in past books, one of my criticisms has been like lack of photos, lack of maps. I feel like when you're telling me a description, I need a map to kind of go with it. And maybe that's just the way my brain works, but I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And then we move on to chapter 5. We're kind of back dealing with Bob Horn's story. It's around his adult life, I would say.
Yeah,
early
like
adult
college
life.
Through adult life.
He was married and lost his wife pretty young to influenza and remarried, and they moved around a few times. So you kind of get this whole story, and it's well written. We don't need to cover all the details here. One point I liked was when he met his second wife, they kind of bonded over playing French horn. And then I loved the line, "It wasn't very long before we exchanged mouthpieces."
I know. I was like,
fantastic.
Is that like a band nerd thing?
Feels like a band nerd thing.
Ew.
And then towards the end of this section, in talking about his history here, they adopt 2 Native American children through an adoption system. This happened in the 1960s. And I was reading about this and I'm like, oh no.
Yeah.
And then towards the end, there's a quote from one or both of the parents, Bob and his wife, talking about the Child Welfare League, says their policy has turned out to be unwise, but we were idealistic and naive.
Yeah, and they both essentially admitted to that.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, I think we're going to deal with this.
Yeah.
I don't think we're just going to brush past this, because I was really, really worried that they were.
And they were young children, too. I think Mary was 2 years old and Jonathan was 11. So even
11 months.
Yeah, 11 months. Sorry. Even like that's to adopt 2 children of that age, even within your same like race and culture, I feel like would be difficult. But then to do it with children who have essentially been forcibly removed from their culture is pretty.
Yes. And we will deal more with that in next chapter. But I was just reassured that it seems like not something we're going to brush past.
Yeah. So in 1976, after, keep in mind they have adopted 2 children. They're both relatively young still. Bob ends up hospitalized. His legs weren't working really well. And he was hospitalized for a while. And he was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome. And, obviously he wasn't going to be able to do survey work. And Bob was like, Ray, get out there and do it without me. And Ray was like, no, I'm going to wait for you. And I like the relationship that's building between Bob and Ray. But they did eventually have a student volunteer help with the survey. Her name was also Jane, which is Bob's wife's name too, but they're 2 separate people. And she helped with survey work. And I like the description where she was talking about how, this was before computers. This was before spreadsheets. It was a lot of just like crunching numbers in her bedroom or whatever on the floor. Just back in the day, archaeology was a lot more work, I feel like.
Yeah. And essentially during this work, they were finding that the earthworks were very suspiciously not aligned with the sun.
Yeah. Ray was frustrated by this.
Yeah. Apparently it brought him to start thinking differently about the whole archaeoastronomy thing. Still skeptical, but starting to wonder now, I think. And then final chapter for this one, chapter 6. This one is really kind of all about Bob's kids, I'd say.
Yeah, the adoption and the issues and the history of the adoption program and stuff.
And the racism that the children faced, not from their parents, but through class, school, and everything, and throughout their life. And it's a bit of a hard read, and I think it should be.
Yeah, and the whole time though, I kept in mind like the context of the times.
Yes,
but like
it wasn't that long ago either.
Right.
Right.
But like when they were talking about like this was again, remember in the 70s, like there are people still alive, including Mary and I presume Jonathan, who were part of this. But there was a quote in here where it said like the best way to get rid of a culture is to rid it of its children or something, or remove its children. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with the Indian boarding schools. This is kind of like a continuation of that.
In the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah. 1960s and 70s.
They would remove Native American children from their families. A lot of times they used things like poverty or alcoholism was a big one, which I thought there was an interesting conversation in there about that, about how from Native American children who were removed for alcoholism tend to happen more often than white children removed from their families for the same issues. And
so these 2 kids were removed from the Menominee in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I guess it was their grandmother who kind of...
well, for the girl. The boy came later from a different family, probably.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. But yeah, so the grandmother of Mary, the daughter...
They do eventually find out as she gave the daughter up.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I know the book didn't lay this out as much as I would have liked, but the Menominee lost federal recognition at one point in the 60s and got it back about 20 years later, which is like, so they were not Indian, heavy air quotes enough here, to be federally recognized, but they were Indian enough to have their children removed from them and their culture destroyed. That's upsetting.
Yeah. Well, it's like there's several stories in here. Like there's one about like a Halloween costume for the American the U.S. bicentennial, where she was kind of forced to wear like an Indian outfit because she essentially fit the mold, right? And then there's another one in here where she's in school and there's a Indian boy from like of India descent, and the teacher is like, "This is an Indian from America. This is an Indian from India." And I was like, "Oh gosh, this is such like a 1970s or 1980s thing to kind of do." Like, I feel,
but it was well handled for the time, which probably could be considered, which is again upsetting.
Yeah.
Oh.
I did appreciate that they had a brief discussion in here about the Cherokee syndrome, which I had never heard it called that, but I'm sure all of our listeners have heard someone say, "Oh, my great great grandma," and it's always on the maternal side, was a Cherokee princess, or, you know, something to that effect. And I guess there was someone within, I believe, the Cherokee Nation that did like a faux kind of genealogical map. And she was like, apparently going back 3 to 4 generations ago, there were no men.
Yeah.
Because everybody's descended from a Cherokee princess. So there's like this weird kind of, would it be like tokenism? I don't know. Like,
I don't know what to think that is. Not good.
Yeah, like we kind of like, I don't know. It's cringy. It's just cringy.
Right.
The whole thing is cringy.
It's like I said, it's kind of a hard read, but it's good, right? I don't want to say it's not good. It's just uncomfortable, but it should be.
Yeah.
Eventually, Mary did reconnect with her culture a little more directly and kind of took more control of that. But even then, it references some racism that she faced, like she won the right to wear eagle feathers, and then at a local powwow in Ohio, someone challenged her on that, and it's like a white person challenged her on that.
And it was, I enjoyed the conversation about powwows because I have met people of Southeastern Native American descent, and I always got the vibe from them that the powwows were for the white people, and like the actual like ceremonial stuff was much more private, and they kind of used the powwows as like a moneymaker a lot of times, but not always. And also
cultural
it was
outreach too.
And yeah, I was just going to say in cultural outreach, but it was a way for a lot of the traditional crafts people, like the people that make all these traditional crafts, to sell their items and things like that too. I've been to a couple, I've enjoyed them, but I feel like as a white person, you have to be aware of like cultural etiquette and realize you're a guest. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily do that.
Yeah, he does cite a person named Ben Barnes from the Shawnee tribe a little bit here, which was good. He's talking specifically about the adoption program, and he referenced the program as the callousness of liberalism, which is interesting. I feel like it might be liberalism off the rails rather than what it's supposed to be, but it's essentially the motivations were to make people better, but as he pointed out, it skipped the step of talking to the people they were supposed to be helping and seeing what better meant to them. And this kind of ties back to kind of some of our core training in archaeology too, in that we are taught to be extremely cautious when it comes to judging another culture.
Yeah.
And that is typically the failing in scenarios like this, I think, is people are judging the culture without taking a step back from their own and looking at it as carefully as possible.
You know, this is why as archaeologists and anthropologists today, we're so careful to work with communities and be guided by the communities. And I noticed in the new like Section 106 situation we have going on, one of the things that is kind of being removed from the requirements for cultural resource surveys is to talk to local informants.
Yeah, and so Section 106 is the major law in the United States that dictates how historic properties are treated. Native American, European, historic properties, all kinds of different things. And a big part of that is that when development is going on, there are requirements to consult with descendant communities or local communities who are going to be affected. And currently, as of like last week, as of recording this, so we're talking 1st of August, essentially, this is under very direct attack in America. And a lot of us are very concerned about where this is going to go. scenario.
And one of the things I noted that was missing, or that they were considering like kind of axing, was the discussing with local informants, and that includes community members. And as you can see here, this is one of the reasons that we feel so strongly that you can't remove that from the picture.
Yeah. Anyway, Ben Barnes also did say that it was an interesting, like, kind of a forgiveness, but also condemnation in one sentence, where like he didn't blame parents who were a part of this, but he said they were part of a racist system.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of a forgiveness and condemnation in one, I felt like almost there, which is fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. And the parents, like Bob and Jane, for example, they were doing it with good intentions. They just didn't, again, like they themselves said, they were naive.
And they weren't equipped to be able to really investigate this themselves, I wouldn't think either.
Yeah, there was no internet.
Right. That's important to remember in this scenario.
So you have to take it, again, within the context.
You didn't have all the arguments on the internet about it.
No Facebook.
Right. But then we do end with, I'm going to say Gertrude Simmons. She has a native name that I don't think I want to try and butcher.
Yeah, no.
Starts with her story. And what a story.
Yeah, and the point of this is like she was kind of forgotten in history, especially during the time when Bob and Jane were dealing with all this and their adopted children. And the author is saying, you know, if they would have known about Gertrude Simmons, maybe they could have kind of pulled from that experience to help Mary. And yeah, what a life. Like, she, like,
honestly, y'all should read about her.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about her probably an entire episode.
She sounds just amazing. But there is some overlap in that she went to a boarding school in the Newark area. And she went to Earham College.
Yeah. She was sent to Earham College on scholarship, I believe.
She was sent to the same college.
Yeah, but she attended Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, I believe in Philadelphia, which is a notorious, essentially, Indian boarding school. And again, people are complex, right? And the author talks about how
she didn't go to Carlisle School as a child. She went to teach there later.
You're right. Yes. Yeah. She taught at Carlisle School, which is interesting because I honestly didn't know that they had Indigenous like teachers, I guess, or instructors there. So that's kind of interesting. And there was this complex relationship with the boarding school director, I guess.
Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, whom listeners may know him for the infamous quote, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man."
Yeah.
So you think, what a monster. But again, the reality is a little more complicated than that.
Yeah. And she, later on in her life, she realizes like some of the experience she was afforded was because of the boarding schools, but that doesn't make it right.
Right.
And, it's
complicated relationship with that sort of a thing too.
Yeah. And like she did a lot and she was amazing. And she fought for women's right to vote, but then she went to the women and said, okay, now you have to fight for all women, and it's really cool. And I'm glad she did exist because she did a lot, but it's like, she shouldn't have had to do that in the first place, So it's a very interesting and complex story. But the point was, if Bob and Jane and Mary kind of knew about Gertrude, they could have kind of pulled from her experience to help Mary, essentially. So it was a really interesting story. And I liked, again, the way he tied in that tangent. So it's important to note before we wrap up the chapter that kind of the history is boarding schools were the original method in which white people removed Native American children from their families. And by the 1970s, they started this adoption assimilation program, I guess you would call it. And later on, that was repealed. And years later after that, in 2001, the Child Welfare League, which was responsible for the adoption program, issued a public apology for that program. And I looked into this a little bit, and Native American adoptions are very, very strict because of this issue now. So, you can't go and adopt a Native American child. They try to keep them within the tribe. They try to keep them within their family, if at all possible. So, at least there's that, I guess.
And that ties back to our conversation about Section 106 there, too, because those laws are there requiring that kind of consultation because of these past abuses.
Yeah.
They aren't just there to inconvenience people.
Right. Yep.
So that wraps us up today, Barbara. What do you think of the book so far?
I I'm really enjoying it. I like the flow. I like the perspective of telling the story of the site through two people's relationships. Like, it's very cool. I'm enjoying it a lot.
The writing is very good.
Yeah.
Very easy to read, very pleasant to read. I find myself sometimes wondering where he's going, and then it turns out he had a place he was going.
Yep.
I appreciate that always. So
yes.
I think this is excellent. And while we might find some critiques here and there, I'd say he's handling difficult issues extremely well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I could do it any better.
No.
So.
No. Nope. I would have, no.
No complaints there. I just appreciate the fact that he is trying to tackle some of these tougher subjects.
Yes, he hasn't brushed over them. That's what I was afraid in that chapter where he brings it up and then doesn't really finish the conversation. I was afraid he was going to do that. And then no, he spent a whole chapter on this.
Yeah.
Because it's important to talk about. And like, wow.
Yeah.
So far, I really like this book, Barbara.
Yeah, same.
I highly recommend it. So for the next episode, we are going to read chapters 7 through 10. And I'm genuinely excited to see where this goes.
Yeah, same.
So until then, we'll see you all next time.
Happy reading, everybody.